The underground fight pit wasn't just a place. It was a beast, alive and snarling. The air clung heavy with the sour reek of sweat, the sharp sting of cheap liquor poured from cracked bottles, and the faint, metallic bite of blood that had dried into the cracks of the floor hours ago. Neon lights buzzed overhead, flickering like wounded stars, casting a sickly glow across damp stone walls. Shadows danced jagged and wild on the concrete, stained dark with the ghosts of men who'd fallen and didn't rise. The crowd was a writhing mass, scarred faces twisted in greed, hands clutching crumpled cash, voices roaring like a storm as two fighters tore into each other in the ring. One was a giant, his nose a pulpy wreck, his fists moving like sledgehammers. He swung hard, a meaty crack splitting the air as his opponent's jaw gave way. The loser crumpled, hitting the canvas with a wet, heavy smack, blood pooling under his head like spilled ink. The mob went wild, stomping and howling, coins clinking as bets paid out fast and furious. This wasn't a sport. This was survival, a brutal, dirty game where you walked out with a fortune or got dragged out cold. The champ flexed his thick arms, grinning through a mouth full of bloody teeth. He was a walking mountain, chest heaving under a sweat-soaked shirt that clung to his barrel frame, scars crisscrossing his skin like trophies etched in flesh. "Who's next?" he bellowed, his voice booming over the chaos, deep and rough like gravel under boots. The crowd cheered louder, their hunger for violence a living thing, pulsing through the pit. Men shouted challenges, others waved cash, but no one dared step up. Not yet. The giant cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp and loud, echoing off the walls. He'd been king of this ring for months, breaking bones and egos with equal ease, and tonight he was riding high on the taste of victory. That's when the air shifted, sudden, electric like a storm about to break. She didn't walk in. She stormed in. Veyra cut through the room like a blade slicing meat, her presence a force that shoved the crowd aside without a touch. People stumbled back, eyes wide, as if their bodies sensed danger before their brains caught up. Her skin shimmered like molten silver, catching the neon light in a way that made her glow, hard and untouchable. Muscles rippled under a combat harness, black leather straps winding tight around her chest, barely containing the full swell of her curves. The outfit hugged her like a second skin, leaving her midriff bare, a slab of toned muscle carved with lines that spoke of power and pain. It stopped just above her hips, where her thighs flexed with every step, thick and strong, built to crush. Long, pointed ears sliced through the air, twitching at the sounds of the pit. The groans of the fallen, the cheers of the bloodthirsty, the clink of glass against glass. Her hair, black as oil, spilled down her back in wild waves, framing a face that was equal parts stunning and terrifying. Her lips, full and dark, parted to reveal teeth sharp enough to tear throats, and her eyes, red as fresh blood, burned with a hunger that promised death. She was an alien warrior, a predator forged on some far-off world where mercy was a myth. She'd killed hundreds, maybe thousands, and wore her pride like armor, unyielding and fierce. "No human can beat me," she snarled, her voice a low, throaty growl that rolled through the pit like a wave crashing against rock. The champ laughed, loud and rough, spitting a glob of blood onto the canvas. "We'll see about that, hot stuff," he said, cracking his knuckles again, the sound snapping through the air. Veyra's lips curled into a savage grin, her hips swaying as she stepped toward the ring, each move dripping with deadly grace. The crowd leaned in, buzzing with excitement, their eyes locked on her. She was a force, raw, unstoppable, a storm of muscle and fury wrapped in leather and silver skin. Her fingers brushed the hilt of a short blade strapped to her thigh, the metal gleaming under the lights, and for a moment, the air grew heavier, thicker, like everyone could taste the blood about to spill. But before she could climb the ropes, another fight broke out near the edge of the pit. A wiry thug with a shaved head and a chipped tooth lunged at his opponent, a lean guy in a worn jacket who'd been sipping a drink by the wall. The thug swung a wild punch, his fist cutting through the air, but the other guy moved fast, ducking low and sidestepping with a grin. "Nice try," he said, voice smooth and cocky, then hooked his foot behind the thug's ankle. One quick yank, and the bigger man stumbled, crashing face first into a rusted metal beam with a dull clang. The crowd snickered as the thug groaned, clutching his busted nose, blood dripping through his fingers. The lean guy straightened up, brushing sweat from his brow, his green eyes sparkling with mischief. He wasn't huge, not like the champ, but his frame was packed with wiry muscle, showing through a tight black shirt under that beat-up jacket. His hair was a mess, dark and damp, and he carried himself like he owned the place. That's when he spoke up, cutting through the noise like a knife. "Hey, big guy," he called to the champ, calm but sharp. "You might want to save those fists for someone who cares." All eyes turned. Jace leaned against the ropes now, his drink still in one hand, the other wiping sweat off his face. He'd just taken down that thug with nothing but a smirk and a trick, and now he was stepping into the light, boots scuffing the gritty floor. The crowd muttered, some laughing, some whispering bets. Veyra's head snapped toward him, her red gaze locking onto him like a predator spotting prey. She moved fast, closing the distance in 3 long strides, her scent hitting him first, hot and sharp, like steel mixed with some alien spice that made his pulse jump. "And who are you?" she snarled, towering over him, her voice dripping with menace and a hint of something darker, something curious. Jace didn't flinch. He tilted his head, meeting her stare with a grin that said he wasn't scared, or if he was, he buried it deep. "Name's Jace," he said, voice smooth and easy, like they were chatting over drinks instead of standing in a pit of death. "And I say you're wrong. Humans, we're full of surprises." Her ears twitched, and she stepped closer, her chest nearly brushing his. Up close, she was even more intimidating, and hell, even more stunning. The leather straps of her harness creaked as she breathed, her silver skin gleaming under the flickering lights, her curves a dangerous promise. Her hand shot out, fingers grazing his shoulder, rough and warm through his shirt. It wasn't a hit. It was a test, a tease, her nails scraping just enough to send a jolt down his spine. The crowd held its breath, waiting for her to strike. Jace didn't back off. He stepped in instead, closing the gap, his hand brushing her bare waist where the harness met smooth, hard muscle. His fingers lingered for a heartbeat, feeling the heat of her, the power coiled tight under her skin. "Give me a week," he said, voice dropping low, steady as steel, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'll prove it." Silence crashed over the pit like a wave. Veyra's breath hitched, just a flicker, so quick you'd miss it if you blinked. She could snap him in half right now, crush his skull with one hand, and paint the floor red. Everyone knew it. She knew it. But something in his stare, bold, cocky, so damn human, stopped her cold. Her lips parted, showing those deadly teeth again. "A week?" she hissed, leaning in so close her breath burned his cheek, her full lips hovering near his ear. "You think 7 days will keep you alive?" Jace's grin stretched wider, fearless and sharp. "Alive? Nah, I'm gonna win." He pulled back, slow and deliberate, leaving her standing there with her eyes blazing red, her chest rising fast. The crowd exploded into whispers, voices tripping over each other in a frantic hum. "He's crazy," a guy muttered, shaking his head. "Dead man walking." Another hissed, laughing nervously. A wiry man in a stained coat elbowed his buddy. 10 creds, says she guts him before he blinks. His friend snorted. 20 says he's bluffing. But not everyone was laughing. A woman near the back, her face half hidden by a hood, watched Jace with narrow eyes, her fingers tapping a small knife against her thigh. "He's got guts," she said to no one, her voice low and thoughtful. "Stupid, maybe, but guts." Another figure, a skinny kid with a shaved head and a cybernetic arm, nudged his friend, pointing at Veyra. "She's gonna eat him alive, man. Look at her. She's a damn nightmare." His friend smirked. "Yeah, but he ain't running. That's something to—" Veyra didn't move, her gaze still locked on Jace as he turned to walk away, his jacket swaying with each step. Inside, her mind churned. She'd fought humans before, weak, fragile things that broke too easy under her fists. She'd crushed their bones, tasted their fear on the air, and left them bleeding out on a dozen worlds. This one was different. He didn't tremble, didn't beg. He looked at her like she was a puzzle to solve, not a monster to fear. It pissed her off and lit something else inside her, something hot and restless she didn't want to name. Her fingers flexed, itching for her blade, but she held back. 7 days. Fine. She'd give him that. Then she'd rip that grin off his face and show him what an alien warrior could do. Her blood hummed at the thought, a mix of rage and something sharper, something she couldn't shake. Jace felt her stare burning into his back as he pushed through the crowd, their bodies parting around him like water. His heart pounded hard, but he kept his steps steady, his grin locked in place. He'd seen the way her eyes flickered, the way her body tensed when he touched her. She was a killer, no doubt, built for it, born for it, but she wasn't invincible. Humans had a way of turning the tables, of taking the impossible and making it theirs. He'd done it before, outsmarted bigger, stronger, meaner bastards than her, and he'd do it again. 1 week. That's all he needed to figure her out, to find a crack in her armor. The pit buzzed behind him, alive with questions no one could answer yet. Who was this guy, taunting death in leather and silver? And what kind of insane plan was he cooking up to face her? Hey, if you're loving the showdown between Jace and Veyra, don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and smack the bell so you're the first to catch every twist. Trust me, it's only getting wilder from here. Got a guess about Jace's plan? Think he's got a shot against her? Drop in the comments below. I read every one, and I want to hear what you think. Let's see if you can figure out what this crazy human's got up his sleeve before Veyra does. The city sprawled under a sky choked with smog, a neon-lit maze of steel and chaos. Towers stabbed upward, their sides plastered with flickering ads, blinking promises of off-world vacations, cheap cyber implants, and instant muscle boosts for anyone desperate enough to sell their dignity. The streets below buzzed with life. Hawkers shouting over the hum of drones, the sizzle of street food frying in oil older than half the crowd, the clatter of boots on wet pavement. Rain fell in thin sheets, smearing the lights into a kaleidoscope of reds, blues, and greens that danced across puddles. It was a loud, messy place alive with the kind of energy that chewed people up and spat them out. Jace loved it. This was his turf, gritty, unpredictable, human to the core. He moved through the throng with easy strides, his worn jacket flapping open, the tight black shirt underneath clinging to his lean frame. His boots splashed through shallow water, kicking up tiny waves as he ducked under a flickering sign that read, "Best noodles this side of the quadrant. No refunds." The fight pit felt like a lifetime ago, but his pulse still hummed from that night. Veyra's red eyes, her silver skin, the heat of her breath on his face. 7 days. That's what he'd bought himself. Not much time, but enough. He wasn't about to waste it lifting weights or punching bags like some meathead. Humans didn't win by playing fair. They won by being smarter, trickier, harder to pin down. And he'd show her that. Veyra watched him from a rooftop perch, her silhouette sharp against the neon glow. She'd tracked him since he left the pit, her long ears twitching at every sound. The hum of the city, the chatter of its people, the faint rhythm of his steps below. Her combat harness hugged her curves tighter in the damp air, leather straps creaking as she shifted, her silver skin glistening with raindrops. She didn't need to hide. Nobody looked up in a place like this, but she stayed out of sight anyway, her red eyes narrowed as they followed Jace. He didn't move like a warrior. No tension in his shoulders, no blade at his hip. Just that cocky grin and a swagger that said he didn't care who was watching. It infuriated her. She'd crushed men twice his size, snapped their spines like twigs, and laughed as their blood stained her hands. What made him think he could stand against her? Down below, Jace slipped into a crowded noodle stall, the air thick with steam and the salty tang of broth. He nodded at the cook, a grizzled guy with a cybernetic eye, and slid onto a stool, his elbows resting on the scratched metal table. "Double portion," he said, tossing a few credits across the counter. The cook grunted, ladling noodles into a bowl, while Jace leaned back, stretching his arms until his shirt pulled tight across his chest. He didn't need to look up to know she was there. He could feel it, those red eyes boring into him hot and heavy. Good. Let her watch. Let her wonder. She dropped from the roof minutes later, landing silent as a shadow on the wet street. The crowd didn't notice, too busy haggling or shoving past each other, but Jace's grin widened as she stepped into the stall. Her presence hit like a punch, tall, fierce, her silver skin catching the dim light, her harness leaving little to the imagination. Water dripped from her hair, tracing paths down her neck, over the curve of her chest, and along her bare midriff. She didn't sit. She loomed, hands on her hips, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is how you prepare?" She growled, low and rough. "Stuffing your face with slop?" Jace looked up, meeting her stare with that same fearless spark. "Hey, carbs are king," he said, twirling a pair of chopsticks between his fingers. "Gotta keep my energy up to kick your ass." Her ears twitched, and she stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her, steel and spice, sharp and wild. The air between them crackled, thick with something neither of them named. "You think food will save you?" she hissed, leaning in, her lips curling to show those deadly teeth. Jace didn't flinch. He stood, slow and deliberate, closing the gap until they were inches apart. "Nah," he said, voice dropping low. "But it'll keep me going long enough to surprise you." Her hand moved fast, brushing his chest. Not a hit, just a graze, her fingers lingering on the fabric over his heartbeat. Warmth spread under her touch, rough and electric, and for a split second, her red eyes flickered with something besides rage. Jace caught it. His hand slid up, grazing her bare waist where the harness met muscle, his fingers tracing the edge of her skin, hard, hot, alive with power. "Try some," he said, holding out the chopsticks, his grin daring her. "Might loosen you up." The crowd around them faded, their noise a dull hum as she stared at him, her breath quickening. She snatched the chopsticks, her fingers brushing his, and stabbed them into the bowl. One bite, salty, rich, a kick of spice, and her ears flicked, a faint twitch she couldn't hide. "Not bad," she muttered, shoving the chopsticks back at him, her voice gruff but softer than before. Jace laughed, a low, easy sound that made her tense. "See? I'm full of good ideas." She glared, but didn't step back. The tension hung thick, their bodies close, the heat of her skin seeping into the air between them. He could feel it, the pull, the challenge, the way she looked at him like she wanted to break him and figure him out all at once. She felt it too, and it pissed her off. She was a warrior, a killer, not some soft thing swayed by a human's tricks. But here she was, still standing there, still watching him. The moment broke when a shout cut through the street. 3 figures shoved through the crowd, thugs, their faces scarred, one with a metal arm glinting under the lights. "Ew," the leader barked, pointing at Jace. "Her to the punk from the pit. Got a mouth on you, huh?" Jace sighed, setting his bowl down. "Yeah, and I'm eating," he said, turning to face them. "Take a number." The thug sneered, lunging with a fist aimed at Jace's head. He ducked, quick and smooth, then slammed his elbow into the guy's gut. The thug doubled over, wheezing, but the other 2 rushed in, one swinging a pipe, the other grabbing for Jace's arm. Veyra's grin flashed, sharp and wild. She didn't wait. She moved like lightning, grabbing the pipe-swinging thug by the neck and hurling him into a stack of crates. Wood splintered, and he hit the ground hard, groaning. The third guy froze, eyes wide, as she turned on him, her red gaze burning. "Run," she snarled, and he bolted, tripping over his own feet. Jace finished off the leader with a quick jab to the jaw, sending him sprawling into a puddle. The whole thing was over in seconds. He straightened up, brushing his hands on his jacket, and glanced at Veyra. "Nice assist," he said, smirking. "Didn't need it, though." She stepped closer, her boots splashing in the water, her eyes locked on his. "You fight sloppy," she said, but there was a glint in her stare. something like respect buried deep. Her hand brushed his arm again, firmer this time, fingers curling around his bicep as if testing his strength. But you don't quit. Jace's smirk softened into something sharper, his hand sliding up to her elbow, grazing the edge of her harness. Told you, he said, voice low and steady. Humans don't play by your rules. Her grip tightened for a heartbeat, her nails digging in just enough to sting. Then she let go, stepping back with a huff. The crowd around them buzzed, whispering about the fight, about her, about him. Jace sat back down, picking up his noodles like nothing happened, but his mind was racing. She was fast, too fast, and stronger than anyone he'd faced. But she jumped in, not to save him, he figured, but to prove something. That meant she was watching him closer than he'd thought. Good. He needed her curious, off balance. 5 days left. He'd spent 2 digging, talking street rats, scanning old fight records, piecing together what made her tick. She was a machine, sure, but every machine had a flaw. He just had to find it. Veyra lingered near the stall, her arms crossed, rain streaking down her silver skin. She didn't need to eat human food or fight street trash to prepare. She'd trained for war since she could walk, forged in battles that left her people's enemies as ash. This human, Jace, he was nothing, a speck, and yet he didn't run, didn't beg. He stood there, grinning, touching her like he had a right to, like he wasn't afraid of what she could do. It gnawed at her, that defiance, that spark in his green eyes. She hated it. She wanted to crush it. But part of her, some small, restless part, wanted to see what he'd do next. The noodle cook coughed, breaking the silence. You two done flirting? Or you want another bowl? He grumbled, his cyber eye whirring as it scanned them. Jace laughed, tossing him a credit. Keep him coming, he said, then glanced at Veyra. You sticking around? She glared, her ears flicking, but didn't answer. Instead, she turned, her hips swaying as she walked back into the rain, her silhouette fading into the neon haze. Jace watched her go, his grin fading into something harder, something determined. She thought she had him figured out. She was wrong. 5 days to go, and he was just getting started. What was he planning that made him so damn sure he could take her? The training facility hummed with a low, electric buzz tucked deep beneath the city's neon sprawl. Its walls were slabs of polished metal, dented and scarred from years of abuse, built to take a beating and keep standing. Overhead, lights flickered to life, casting a cold, white glow across the chamber. The floor gleamed, smooth and hard, designed to handle anything. Explosions, punches, bodies hitting it fast and ugly. This wasn't some fancy gym with cushion mats and water breaks. This was a war room, a place where warriors sharpened their edges or broke trying. Jace stood in the center, his boots planted firm, his jacket slung over a crate in the corner. His tight shirt hugged his lean frame, sweat already beading on his brow from the heat of the place. 5 days down, 2 to go. He'd spent the week digging, watching, planning. Now was time to test what he'd learned. Veyra strode in like she owned it, her combat harness creaking as she moved. The black leather straps dug into her silver skin, framing her curves in a way that was both fierce and distracting. Rain from the streets still clung to her, dripping down her neck, tracing the hard lines of her chest and stomach. Her long ears twitched at the hum of the room, her red eyes scanning every inch like a predator sizing up a kill. She carried no weapons today, just her body, all muscle and menace, her thighs flexing under the harness as she stopped a few feet from Jace. You wanted this, she said, her voice a low growl, rough and sharp. Let's see if you survive it. Jace grinned, wiping his hands on his pants. Bring it on, he said, his tone light but his eyes hard. He wasn't here to die. He was here to win. She didn't waste time. With a flick of her wrist, she tapped a control panel on the wall. The room shuddered, a deep rumble rolling through the floor as holographic projectors whirred to life. Pixels swirled, forming a figure in the center, a massive, brutish thing with arms like battering rams and a face carved from nightmares. It roared, a sound that shook the walls, and charged at Jace. He dove to the side, rolling across the floor as its fist slammed down where he'd been, cracking the metal with a screech. "Nice welcome," he muttered, popping back up, his breath quick but steady. Veyra crossed her arms, her lips curling into a smirk. "Too slow," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "You be dead already." Jace didn't argue. He ducked another swing, the air whistling past his ear, then darted in close, slamming his shoulder into the hologram's side. It staggered, flickering as its code struggled to adjust. He didn't have Veyra's strength. No human did, but he had speed, and he had guts. The thing swung again, and he dropped low, sweeping its legs. It crashed down, and he finished it with a hard stomp to its chest. The hologram blinked out, dissolving into sparks. Jace straightened, brushing sweat from his eyes, and shot Veyra a grin. "One down," he said, panting. "What's next?" Her smirk faded, replaced by a glint of something sharper in her red eyes. She tapped the panel again, and the room shifted. 2 new holograms appeared, faster, leaner, with blades for hands. They moved like wolves, circling him, their metal edges glinting under the lights. Jace's grin faltered for a second, but he shook it off. "Okay," he said, cracking his neck. "Let's dance." They lunged, and he dodged, barely, the first blade slicing a shallow cut across his arm. Blood welled up, hot and red, but he didn't stop. He grabbed a loose pipe from the floor, one Veyra must have left there, and swung it hard, catching one hologram in the head. It sparked and fell, but the second slashed at his back, tearing his shirt. He spun, gritting his teeth, and drove the pipe through its chest. Both went down, flickering out in a shower of light. Veyra stepped forward, her boots clicking on the floor, her eyes locked on him. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice flat but her gaze intense. Jace shrugged, wiping the cut with his sleeve. "Just a scratch," he said, meeting her stare. "I've had worse." She moved closer, too close, her scent hitting him, steel and spice, mixed with the faint musk of her sweat. Her hand shot out, grabbing his arm, her fingers curling around the muscle, rough and warm. "You fight like a fool," she growled, her nails digging in just enough to sting. "No form, no power." Jace didn't pull away. He stepped in, his chest brushing hers, his hand sliding up to grip her elbow, feeling the strength under her silver skin. "Maybe," he said, voice low and steady. "But I'm still standing." Her breath hitched, a flicker of heat in her eyes, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Her grip tightened, her thumb brushing his bicep, tracing the line of his muscle. His hand moved higher, grazing the edge of her harness where it met her bare waist, his fingers pressing into the heat of her. "You're reckless," she hissed, leaning in, her lips so close he could feel her words on his skin. "It'll get you killed." Jace's grin sharpened, his green eyes locked on hers. "Or it'll beat you," he said, his voice a challenge, his fingers lingering just long enough to make her tense. She shoved him back, hard, but her ears twitched, betraying the crack in her armor. Again, she snapped, turning to the panel. The room rumbled, and a new hologram appeared, this one bigger, uglier, with claws that gleamed like razors. Jace didn't hesitate. He charged, dodging a swipe that would have gutted him, then leapt onto its back, wrapping his arm around its neck. It thrashed, roaring, but he held tight, twisting until it flickered and crashed to the floor. He rolled off, landing on his feet, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. Veyra watched, her arms crossed, her red eyes narrowed. "Better," she said, her voice grudging, but still weak. Jace laughed, a rough, breathless sound. "Weak's what you call it," he said, wiping his face. "I call it winning." She stepped closer again, her boots echoing in the quiet, and grabbed his shirt, yanking him toward her. Her fingers twisted in the fabric, pulling him so close their breaths mixed, his ragged, hers steady but fast. "You talk too much," she growled, her lips hovering near his, her red eyes burning into him. "Show me." Jace's hand shot up, gripping her wrist, his thumb pressing into the pulse under her silver skin. "Oh, I will," he said, voice low and raw, his other hand brushing her hip, firm and deliberate. Just watch. She pushed him away again, harder this time, her chest rising fast, her ears flicking wildly. "Prove it," she snarled, tapping the panel. The room roared to life, and 3 holograms materialized, tall, fast, armed with spears that hummed with energy. Jace cracked his knuckles, his grin back in full force. "Game on," he said, diving in. He moved like a blur, ducking spears, slamming one hologram into another, using their own momentum against them. Blood trickled from his arm, his shirt hung in tatters, but he didn't stop. One went down, then 2, and the third lunged, its spear grazing his side. He grunted, grabbed the shaft, and yanked it free, driving it through the hologram's chest. It flickered out, and he stood there, panting victorious. Veyra didn't clap or cheer. She walked over, slow and deliberate, her boots clicking, her eyes locked on him. "You're a mess," she said, her voice low, almost soft. Jace straightened, brushing sweat and blood from his face. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "A mess that keeps coming back." She stopped inches away, her hand reaching out, brushing his chest where his shirt gaped open, her fingers tracing the edge of a fresh bruise. The touch was rough, possessive, sending a jolt through him. "Why?" she asked, her voice quieter now, her red eyes searching his. "Why don't you quit?" Jace's hand moved, catching hers, holding it against his skin, his grip firm. "Because I'm human," he said, his voice steady, his eyes fierce. "We don't break. We bend." Her breath caught, her ears stilling for the first time, and the air between them thickened, charged with something raw and unspoken. Her fingers pressed harder, nails scraping his chest, her other hand brushing his side, lingering near his hip. Jace didn't flinch. He leaned in, his hand sliding up her arm, gripping her elbow, pulling her closer until their bodies nearly touched. "You're tough," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I'm tougher." Her lips parted, a flicker of something, anger, respect, heat, flashing in her eyes. She yanked her hand free, stepping back, her chest heaving. "We'll see," she hissed, but her voice shook just a little. The door slid open, and a tech stumbled in, a skinny guy with goggles and a tablet, his face paling as he saw them. Sorry," he stammered, glancing at the wrecked holograms. "Systems overheating." "You done?" Veyra glared, her ears flicking, but Jace laughed, tossing his torn shirt over his shoulder. "For now," he said, shooting her a look. 2 days left. Plenty of time. The tech scurried out, muttering about repairs, leaving them alone again. Veyra crossed her arms, her red eyes still on Jace, her mind spinning. He was reckless, stubborn, weaker than her in every way that should matter. But he didn't fall, didn't beg. He kept coming, kept grinning, and it was starting to get under her skin. Jace grabbed his jacket, slinging it on, his muscles flexing under the bruises and cuts. 2 days. He'd pushed her today, tested her, and he'd seen it, that crack in her pride, that flicker in her eyes. She was a warrior, a killer, but she wasn't untouchable. He'd find her limit, and he'd break it. Not with strength, with will. As he walked out, her voice stopped him cold. "You won't win," she said, low and fierce. But there was a question in it, a doubt she couldn't hide. Jace turned, his grin sharp as a blade. "Bet on it," he said, and disappeared into the hall, leaving her standing there, fists clenched, heart pounding. 2 days to go, and she was starting to wonder, what if he actually could? The simulation chamber growled to life, a deep hum vibrating through the metal walls as Jace stepped inside. The air was dry and hot, already prickling his skin, a stark change from the damp streets above. He tossed his jacket onto a crate near the door, leaving him in his torn black shirt, the fabric clinging to his lean frame, streaked with sweat and faint traces of blood from the last session. 2 days left. He'd pushed hard in training, taken every hit Veyra threw at him, and come out grinning. Now was time to step up. The chamber's lights dimmed, and the floor shifted under his boots, grinding as it transformed. Sand spilled out, coarse and golden, swallowing the smooth metal until he stood in a vast desert. Twin suns blazed overhead, their heat slamming down like a fist, casting long, twisted shadows across dunes that stretched forever. Wind howled, whipping grains against his face, stinging his eyes. This wasn't just a fight. This was a crucible. Veyra followed him in, her combat harness creaking as she moved, black leather straps hugging her silver skin tighter in the dry air. Sand dusted her bare midriff, catching in the curves of her muscles, her thighs flexing as she planted herself near the control panel. Her long ears twitched at the wind's roar, her red eyes glinting under the harsh light. She looked like she belonged here, wild, fierce, a warrior carved from the chaos of this alien hellscape. "This is your test," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, low and rough. "Survive it." Jace cracked his neck, brushing sand from his hands. "Survive," he said, grinning. "I'm going to do better than that." Her lips curled, a flash of sharp teeth, but her eyes stayed locked on him, sharp and curious. She tapped the panel, and the desert roared. A shape rose from the dunes, a massive beast, its hide thick with armored plates, claws like scythes gleaming in the sun. It stood twice Jace's height, its eyes glowing yellow, a snarl ripping from its throat that shook the sand under his feet. "Meet your friend," Veyra called, her voice edged with a smirk. "Straight from my world. Good luck." Jace squinted at it, his grin fading for a second. "Nice pet," he muttered, then bolted as it charged, its claws slashing the air where he'd been. Sand exploded around him, and he rolled down a dune, spitting grit from his mouth. Veyra crossed her arms, watching, her silver skin shimmering as the wind tugged at her hair. He didn't have a weapon. Not yet. The beast lunged again, faster this time, its tail whipping out like a lash. Jace ducked, barely, the tip grazing his shoulder, tearing a fresh rip in his shirt. Blood welled up, hot and sticky, but he kept moving, his mind racing. Strength wouldn't win this. He couldn't punch through armor like Veyra could. He had to think. His eyes darted around, dunes, rocks, a glint of something metal half buried in the sand. A trap? A tool? He sprinted toward it, the beast roaring behind him, its claws pounding the ground. Veyra's ears flicked, her smirk fading as she leaned forward, her red eyes narrowing. What was he doing? Jace reached the glint, a jagged shard of steel, maybe part of an old ship, rusted but sharp. He yanked it free, sand spilling off it, and spun just as the beast closed in. Its claws swiped down, and he dove under, sliding across the sand, the shard slashing at its leg. It hit armor, sparking, but caught a soft spot near the joint. The beast screeched, stumbling, and Jace rolled to his feet, panting. "Gotcha," he said, wiping sweat from his eyes. Veyra's hand tightened on the panel, her breath catching. He wasn't running. He was fighting, smart, not hard. The beast turned, furious, its tail whipping again. Jace ducked, but clipped his side, sending him sprawling into the sand. Pain flared sharp and bright, but he gritted his teeth, pushing up fast. The shard was still in his hand, his knuckles white around it. He circled, watching the beast's movements, its heavy steps, the way it favored its wounded leg. "Come on," he muttered, dodging another swipe, then darted in, slashing at the same spot. Blood sprayed this time, dark and thick, staining the sand. The beast roared, rearing up, and Jace saw his chance. He lunged, driving the shard into its underbelly, twisting hard. It thrashed, claws raking the air, then collapsed with a final, shuddering growl, its body flickering as the simulation reset. Jace stood there, chest heaving, sand and blood streaking his face, the shard dripping in his hand. He turned to Veyra, grinning through the mess. "Told you," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Better than surviving." She stepped forward, her boots crunching the sand, her red eyes locked on him. The wind tugged at her hair, her silver skin glowing under the twin suns, her harness straining as she breathed. "Luck," she said, her voice gruff, but her ears twitched, betraying her. Jace laughed, tossing the shard aside. "Luck's just planning you don't see," he said, wiping his face with his sleeve. She closed the gap, fast, her hand grabbing his arm where the blood still trickled. Her fingers curled around his bicep, rough and warm, her nails digging in just enough to sting. "You're hurt," she said, her voice low, her eyes searching his. Jace didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his chest brushing hers, sand grinding between them. "Worth it," he said, his hand sliding up to grip her elbow, feeling the power under her silver skin. "Prove my point." Her breath hitched, her grip tightening, her thumb brushing the cut, smearing blood across his arm. The air thickened, charged with heat and something sharper, something that made her red eyes flicker. "You think this changes anything?" she hissed, leaning in, her lips hovering near his, her breath hot against his skin. "You're still weak." Jace's grin sharpened, his other hand brushing her hip, firm and deliberate, tracing the edge of her harness where it met muscle. "Weak's what you call it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I call it winning." Her ears flicked wildly, her chest rising fast, and for a moment, she didn't push him away. Her hand slid up, brushing his chest, fingers splaying over the torn shirt, feeling the heartbeat underneath. "You're a fool," she growled, but her voice shook, just a little, her nails scraping his skin. The simulation beeped, breaking the moment, a warning from the panel about system strain. Veyra stepped back, her hand dropping, her red eyes still burning into him. "Rest," she said, her voice gruff, turning to the controls. "You'll need it." Jace laughed, a rough, easy sound brushing sand from his hair. "I'm good," he said, grabbing his jacket. "One more day. Plenty of time." She didn't answer, her fingers hovering over the panel, her mind spinning. He'd beaten it. Not with power, not with her kind of strength, but with something else. Something human. It gnawed at her, that stubborn spark, that refusal to break. She'd seen warriors die under less, crushed by beasts like that without a whimper. He didn't just survive. He fought back, and he won. Jace slung his jacket over his shoulder, his muscles flexing under the cuts and bruises, sand still clinging to his skin. One day left. He'd shown her today, shown her he wasn't just talk. She was fast, strong, a machine built for war, but he had something she didn't: adaptability. He'd found the beast's weak spot, turned its own size against it. That's how humans won, not by being the biggest, but by being the sharpest. He glanced back at her, catching her staring, her red eyes unreadable. "What?" he said, smirking. "Like what you see." Veyra's ears twitched, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You're still alive," she said, her voice low, almost a challenge. "For now." He laughed, heading for the door, his boots kicking up sand. "Keep watching," he called over his shoulder. "It's only going to get better." The door slid shut behind him, leaving Veyra alone in the desert, the wind howling around her. Her fists clenched, her silver skin gleaming under the twin suns, her heart pounding with something she couldn't name. Anger, respect, maybe more. He was a speck, a human, nothing compared to her. But he'd beaten her test, turned it on its head, and walked away grinning. One day left, and she couldn't shake the thought. What else was he hiding up his sleeve? The city pulsed with neon and noise, a cyberpunk jungle where shadows hid secrets and light burned lies into every corner. Rain streaked through the air, smearing the glow of towering billboards that screamed ads for cheap implants and off-world dreams. The streets below were a mess of life. Vendors hawking glowing trinkets, drones buzzing overhead, the sizzle of meat on grills mixing with the stink of exhaust and wet concrete. Crowds shoved past each other, voices shouting in a dozen languages, boots splashing through puddles that reflected the chaos above. Jace moved through it all, his jacket open, his torn shirt clinging to his lean frame, damp with rain and sweat. One day left. The desert fight had been a win, but this was different. Veyra had thrown him into a new test, and he was ready to show her what humans could really do. She stood beside him, her silver skin gleaming under the neon, her combat harness slick with water. The black leather straps hugged her curves tight, rain tracing paths down her bare midriff, dripping off her thighs as she scanned the street. Her long ears twitched at every sound. The hum of engines, the chatter of the crowd, the faint whine of drones overhead. Her red eyes glowed, sharp and restless, her presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. "This isn't a fight," she said, her voice low and rough, brushing against the noise. "It's a hunt. Track the target. No killing unless I say so." Jace grinned, brushing wet hair from his eyes. "A chase, huh?" he said, his tone light, but his gaze steady. "I'm good at those." She handed him a small comm device, a sleek black earpiece that buzzed faintly as he slipped it in. "Target's a runner," she said, tapping a hollow screen on her wrist. An image flickered up, a figure in a hooded cloak, face hidden, last seen in the District 7 market. "Find them. Bring them back." Jace studied the image, his mind already turning. "Got it," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see how fast they run." Veyra's lips curled, a hint of sharp teeth showing. "Don't fail," she said, her voice a challenge, her red eyes locking on his. He smirked, stepping closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "Watch me," he said, his voice low, then turned and melted into the crowd. The market was a riot of color and sound, stalls packed with sizzling food, glowing tech, and shouting vendors, all crammed under a canopy of flickering lights. Jace slipped through, his boots quiet on the wet ground, his green eyes scanning every face. The comm crackled in his ear. "Target's moving east," Veyra's voice said, sharp and steady. "Don't lose them." He didn't answer, just adjusted his pace, weaving past a guy selling cracked data pads, ducking under a drone hauling cargo. The cloak flashed ahead, a gray blur slipping into an alley. Jace followed, his heart kicking up, rain dripping down his neck. The alley was narrow, walls lined with rusted pipes and buzzing wires, the air thick with the smell of oil and rot. He pressed against the wall, peering around the corner. The target was there, hood up, moving fast, a small pack slung over their shoulder. "Got eyes on them," he muttered into the comm, keeping his voice low. "You sure I can't just tackle him?" Veyra's reply was dry. "No. Too messy. Use your head." Jace chuckled, sliding along the wall, his boots silent on the slick ground. "Head's my best weapon," he said, and cut the comm. The target darted left, disappearing behind a stack of crates. Jace didn't chase outright. He circled, cutting through a side street, his mind mapping the layout. He'd grown up in places like this, learned to read streets like a book. They'd double back, he figured, try to lose him in the crowd. Sure enough, the cloak reappeared, slipping into the market again. Smart, but not smart enough. He moved fast, blending in, head down, shoulders loose, just another guy in the chaos. The target slowed, glancing back, thinking they'd shaken him. Jace closed the gap, staying a few steps behind, his eyes locked on the pack. Something about it, too heavy, too stiff, caught his attention. Not just a runner, a courier. He tapped the comm. "They're carrying something," he said, voice low. "Not just running for fun." Veyra's voice crackled back, sharp. "What is it?" Jace grinned, slipping past a stall. "Gimme a sec," he said, and picked up his pace. The target bolted, sensing him now, shoving through the crowd. Jace followed, dodging a cart, leaping over a pile of trash, his boots splashing through puddles. They ducked into another alley, narrower, darker, the walls closing in. Jace lunged, grabbing their arm, yanking them back. The hood fell, revealing a thin face, human, young, eyes wide with panic. "Let go!" they snapped, twisting free, but Jace was faster, pinning them against the wall with his forearm. "Not happening," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What's in the bag?" The runner glared, breathing hard, then sighed, pulling a small drive from the pack, a pulsing blue light glowing inside it. "This," they said, voice low. "Proof the drones aren't security. They're control." Jace's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. He tapped the comm. "Veyra, you hearing this?" Silence. Then her voice came through, steady but tense. "I'm listening." The runners shifted, their eyes darting. "They watch everything," they said, quieter now. "Track us. Own us. This drive's got the data, codes, logs, all of it." Jace took it, turning it over in his hand, the blue light catching in the rain. "Big problem," he said into the comm, what's the call? Veyra's reply was slow, measured. Bring it back. No blood. Jace nodded, pocketing the drive, then looked at the runner. You're coming too, he said, loosening his grip, but keeping him close. Move. They headed back, cutting through the market, the runner tense but quiet beside him. Jace kept his eyes sharp, scanning for tails, drones, thugs, anything. The comm buzzed again. You're clear, Veyra said, her voice closer now. He glanced up, spotting her on a rooftop, her silver skin glinting as she dropped down, landing soft in front of them. Her red eyes flicked to the runner, then to Jace, lingering on the drive in his hand. You got it, she said, her voice low, almost impressed. Jace smirked, stepping closer, rain dripping off his hair. Told you I'm good at this, he said, his shoulder brushing hers, his hand grazing her arm as he handed over the drive. Her fingers brushed his, warm and rough, and she held his gaze, her ears twitching. No killing, she said, her voice gruff, but her eyes softened, just a flicker. Jace's grin widened, his hand sliding up to her elbow, feeling the muscle under her silver skin. Didn't need to, he said, his voice low, steady. Brains over brawn. She stepped closer, her chest nearly touching his, her hand brushing his side, fingers lingering near his hip. You think you're clever, she growled, her breath hot against his ear, her red eyes burning into him. Maybe, he said, his hand resting on her waist, firm and deliberate. Or maybe I'm just better. Her grip tightened, nails scraping his skin through the torn shirt, and for a moment, the rain and noise faded, leaving just them, close, tense, the air thick with heat. You're still a fool, she hissed, but her voice shook, her ears flicking wildly. Jace laughed, soft and rough, pulling back just enough to meet her stare. A fool who won, he said, his green eyes sharp, unyielding. She let go, stepping back, her chest heaving, the drive clutched in her hand. We're done here, she said, turning away, but her glance back betrayed her. Something new in her red eyes, something like respect. The runner shifted, nervous, but Jace clapped their shoulder. Stick with us, he said, nodding toward Veyra. Safer that way. They headed out, the city buzzing around them, the drive a quiet weight in Veyra's grip. Jace walked beside her, his jacket dripping, his mind racing. One day left, and he'd turned her hunt into his victory. No fists, no blood, just smarts, the kind humans thrived on. She'd wanted proof he could keep up, and he'd given it, flipped the game, and walked away with the prize. He glanced at her, catching her staring, her red eyes unreadable but intense. What? He said, smirking. Impressed yet? Veyra's lips pressed thin, her ears still, but she didn't answer, just kept walking, her silence louder than words. Back at the facility, the runner sat quiet in a corner, the drive on a table between them. Jace leaned against the wall, arms crossed, rain still dripping from his hair. Veyra stood opposite, her silver skin gleaming under the lights, her harness creaking as she shifted. You didn't fight, she said, her voice low, probing. Why? Jace shrugged, his grin easy but his eyes hard. Didn't need to, he said. Fighting's your thing. Winning's mine. Her ears twitched, her hand brushing the drive, and she stepped closer, her shadow falling over him. You think this makes you equal? She asked, her voice a challenge, her red eyes searching his. Jace straightened, closing the gap, his hand grazing her arm, firm and warm. Equal, he said, his voice low, steady. Nah, different. And that's why I'm still here. Her breath caught, her fingers brushing his chest, lingering on the wet fabric, the heat of her touch seeping through. One day left, she said, her voice rough, almost a whisper. What now? Jace's grin sharpened, his hand resting on her hip, feeling the strength under her silver skin. Now, he said, his eyes locked on hers. I finished what I started. She didn't pull away, her red eyes burning, and the air between them crackled with something unspoken, something big, something dangerous. One day to go, and the game had just shifted. What was he going to pull off next? The facility's break room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past week. No neon glare, no roaring crowds, just soft, steady lights spilling from a single overhead bulb, casting a warm glow over scuffed metal walls. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cinnamon from a vending machine humming in the corner, its screen flickering with a glitchy menu. Rain tapped against a small window, a muted rhythm that softened the silence. Jace slumped into a chair, his jacket draped over the back, his torn shirt still damp from the city's downpour. Bruises marked his arms, cuts traced his skin, but his lean frame held steady, his green eyes bright despite the wear. 6 days of hell, fights, chases, tests, and he'd walked out on top. 1 day left, and it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a start. Veyra stood across from him, her silver skin catching the light, her combat harness creaking as she leaned against the table. Water still clung to her, beating on her bare midriff, tracing the hard lines of her muscles. Her long ears twitched at the rain's patter, her red eyes softer now, less like fire and more like embers. The drive from the chase sat between them, its blue light pulsing faintly, a quiet reminder of what they'd pulled off. She didn't sit, not her style, but she didn't loom either. She just watched him, her arms crossed, her full lips pressed into a line that wasn't quite a frown. "You made it," she said, her voice low, rough, but missing its usual edge. Jace grinned, leaning back, his hands behind his head. "Told you I would," he said, his tone easy, his eyes locked on hers. Humans don't quit. She didn't argue, didn't growl. She just stood there, her gaze steady, searching his face like she was seeing him for the first time. A week ago, she'd called him weak, a fool, a speck not worth her time. Now, after the pit, the desert, the chase, he was still here, grinning, unbroken, a human who'd turned her tests inside out. She'd thrown everything at him, beasts, blades, a city full of traps. And he'd come through, not with her strength, but with something else. Something she didn't have. Her ears flicked, a small twitch, and she stepped closer, her boots quiet on the floor. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer, almost a whisper. "Why push so hard?" Jace dropped his hands, sitting up, his grin fading into something realer, harder. "Because I had to," he said, his voice steady, his green eyes fierce. "You said no human could beat you. I proved you wrong." She didn't flinch, didn't snap back. Her hand moved, brushing the table, her fingers lingering near his. "You didn't beat me," she said, her voice gruff, but there was no venom in it, just truth. Jace's grin returned, sharp and quick. "Maybe not," he said, leaning forward, his elbow on the table, his hand inching closer to hers. "But I beat everything you threw at me. That's close enough." Her breath caught, a faint hitch, and she didn't pull away. She stepped around the table, closing the gap, her shadow falling over him. Her hand brushed his knee under the table, rough and warm, her nails grazing his skin through his pants. "You're still a fool," she said, her voice low, her red eyes locked on his, but a faint curve tugged at her lips, almost a smile. Jace's hand moved, catching hers, holding it against his knee, his thumb brushing her silver skin. "A fool who won," he said, his voice a rumble, his eyes steady. "And you liked it." Her ears twitched wildly, her chest rising fast, and for a moment, the room shrank, just them, the rain, the heat of her touch. Her hand slid up, brushing his thigh, firm and deliberate, her fingers tracing the edge of his muscle. "Don't push it," she growled, but her voice shook, her red eyes flickering with something hot, something new. Jace didn't back off. He leaned in, his other hand grazing her arm, feeling the strength under her harness, pulling her closer until their breaths mixed. "Too late," he said, his grin sharp, his green eyes burning. "I already did." She didn't shove him away. Her hand stayed, pressing harder, her nails digging in just enough to sting, her silver skin warm against his. "You're impossible," she muttered, her voice rough, her lips hovering near his, close enough to feel the heat. Jace's grin softened, his hand sliding up to her elbow, holding her there. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, raw. "And you're stuck with me." Her ears stilled, her red eyes searching his, and for the first time, she didn't argue, just stood there, caught in the pull between them. The vending machine beeped, spitting out a cup of coffee nobody asked for, breaking the silence. Veyra pulled back, her hand slipping free, but her eyes didn't leave his. She grabbed the cup, shoving it into his hands with a huff. "Drink," she said, her voice gruff, stepping back to lean against the wall. Jace took it, his fingers brushing hers, a spark jumping between them. "Thanks," he said, sipping the bitter brew, his grin creeping back. "Guess this means I'm not dead yet." She crossed her arms, her silver skin gleaming, her red eyes narrowing. "Not yet," she said, but that faint curve stayed on her lips, a crack in her pride she couldn't hide. He set the cup down, standing slow, his jacket slung over his shoulder. "One day left," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on hers. "What's the plan?" Veyra didn't answer right away. She watched him, her ears twitching, her mind turning. He'd changed something, shifted the ground under her feet. She was a warrior, forged in blood and steel, but he'd matched her, not with fists, but with will, with smarts, with that damn human spark. "No plan," she said finally, her voice low, steady. "You've done enough." Jace's grin widened, his hand brushing her arm as he stepped closer, his touch firm, warm. "Enough?" he said, his voice a challenge. "I'm just warming up." She didn't push him away this time. Her hand moved, brushing his chest, lingering on the torn shirt, feeling the heartbeat underneath. "To unpredictability," she said, her voice rough, raising the coffee cup she'd snatched back from him. Jace laughed, soft and real, grabbing another cup from the machine, clinking it against hers. "To kicking ass," he said, his green eyes bright, his grin unyielding. They drank, the rain tapping outside, the room quiet but alive with something new. Respect, trust, a promise neither spoke aloud. Jace turned to go, his boots scuffing the floor, but he paused at the door, glancing back. "See you tomorrow," he said, his voice light, his eyes sharp. Veyra didn't answer, just watched him, her red eyes glowing, her silver skin catching the light. He grinned, stepping out, leaving her standing there, the coffee warm in her hand, her heart pounding with a question she couldn't shake. What would he do next? This human who'd turned her world upside down.